Chapter 8 of Tractate Shabbos starts with a continuation with a few of the previous Mishnahs, listing the minimum amounts of specific objects in regards to them being forbidden to carry on Shabbos. So, first Mishnah, the minimum amount that you're not allowed to carry outside of some more substances on Shabbos, being wine. The minimum for it to be problematic is enough to mix a cup with, milk enough for a swallow, honey enough to place on a sore, oil enough to anoint a small limb, water enough to mix in eye salve, all other liquids, even wastewater, a revi'is, which is an old form of measurement, which is somewhere around 4 ounces. Rabbi Shimon holds that all of these substances are minimum a revi'is, and it's listing the smaller substances for people that store these substances. The Gemara explains the wine amount, saying it's enough for a nice cup, which is a cup of wine for the blessing after a meal. That amount is a quarter of a revi'is, so if you mix in water, it adds up to a revi'is total. The sources for this in regards to wine mixing are argued. One opinion states that if you carry dried, congealed wine, the minimum is an olive-sized piece. Again, proofs are brought. With regards to milk, enough for a swallow, it discusses the spelling a bit. It cites a few verses in this regard. Regarding milk, it also clarifies that animal milk, the minimum is a swallow, but human milk and also egg whites are enough to use as some sort of an ointment. And regarding that ointment, it's the minimum amount required to mix it with water. It's an unresolved question if this is enough ointment for the application or enough to hold on your finger. Honey, we said, was the minimum to place on a sore. It's unresolved if this is the entire sore or just the tip of it. Bit of a side point, everything God created was necessary. The slug can remedy sores, the fly to cure hornet stings, the gnat for snake bites, the snake for certain boils, and the spider for the sting of scorpions. The snakes are good for boils, apparently by cooking a black and white snake together and rubbing that mixture on the boil. It also says that there are 5 fears, where the strong fear the weak. The mafkia, which is some sort of an animal with a powerful cry that the lion is afraid of. The elephant fears the gnat, the scorpion fears the spider, the eagle fears the swallow, and the kilbis, a little fish that burrows into big fish's ears, is feared by the leviathan. A few other miscellaneous teachings. It's said that goats, which are darker, walk at the front of flocks in front of lighter sheep to reflect the creation of the world where it was dark than light. Furthermore, a sheep's tail covers itself, unlike a goat, because people get their clothes from sheep. Also, a camel has a short tail because it eats thorns, which could get tangled, and an ox has a long tail because it lives in swampland and needs to chase away gnats. Locusts have antennae that are soft because it lives by willows, so if the antennae were rigid, they'd break and it'd be blinded, which is how you blind an antenna. Also, roosters have their lower eyelids closed first because there's often smoke under the beams where it lives, and if smoke got into its eyes, it'd be blinded. It also explains why many words are called by their name. Lastly, it says there are 3 animals that get stronger as they age: fish, snakes, and swine. Next, we said the minimum for oil was enough to anoint a small limb. This is explained to be the little finger of a day-old infant. This is argued on a bit, but that's the opinion we hold like. In regards to water amounts, there's a principle, which is that if a substance has 2 uses, one common and one not common, it follows the common use always. If they are both common uses, it follows the one that will result in astringency. For instance, wine is used for drinking and less often healing, so it goes according to the drinking, even though that's more lenient. Honey is used for eating and also equally healing, so it goes like the healing, as that's stricter. Water, however, goes by its healing use, even though that's not common, as it is actually commonly used for healing in Galilee, or possibly just everywhere. The point on other types of bloods being a revi'is includes bloods of some animals. Wastewater is useful for kneading clay, of some amount depending on your intent. New Mishnah. Some more minimums for carrying. Rope, the minimum required to make a basket. Reed grass, enough to make a handle for a sieve. Rabbi Yehuda holds it enough to measure a child's foot for a shoe. Paper, enough to write a tax collector's receipt on it, and if you take out a tax collector's receipt, you're liable. Erased paper, enough to wrap around the mouth of a flask of balsam oil. Hide, enough to make an amulet. Parchment, enough to write the smallest passage of tefillin on it, Shema Yisrael. Ink, enough to write 2 letters. Eye paint, enough to paint 1 eye. Glue, enough to place on the head of a board. Pitch or sulfur, enough to form a hole. Wax, enough to place on the opening of a small hole. Crushed brick, enough to make an opening for the crucible of a gold refiner. Rabbi Yehuda says enough to make a tripod. Bran, enough to put on the opening of a gold refiner crucible. Lime, which was used as a depilatory, enough for the littlest finger of a girl. Rabbi Yehuda says it's enough to make the hair on your temples lie flat, while Rabbi Nehemiah says it's enough to smear on your forehead. The Gemara explains that rope is not used for handles of sieves, as this is coarse rope, which is not used for that, as it could damage the utensil. It expounds on many of these, particularly on the points about tax collector's receipts, which is argued if it's still useful, whether to show to the tax collector's runners, or it's an argument if there's a chief tax collector and a subordinate, so you need to keep it to show both. or because you need the receipt to show to other tax collectors to prove that you pay your taxes in general. A similar dispute exists by a loan document. It also discusses many of the other measurements, particularly in regards to hides and its attributes, along with other specific types of hides and some points on laws of impurity. It similarly discusses the different scrolls, be it for tefillin, mezuzah, and their respective sizes. In regards to ink, it asks what's the law if you have a combination of a letter's worth of dried ink, a letter's worth on a quill, and a letter's worth in an inkwell, as each of those normally have the minimum of an amount sufficient to write 2 letters, so what's the law if smaller amounts of them all combine? So it says we don't know. This gets into a bit of a longer point about minimums in regards to ink and writing. Eye paint minimum is only for 1 eye, as some modest women will veil their faces and only paint 1 eye. By village women, it would be 2 eyes worth based on a source. The amount of wax was sufficient to plug a wine barrel hole. The glue is on the head of the board on a reed of a bird trapper. The point about crushed brick, according to Rabbi Yehuda, could actually be to plaster the cracks in the tripod of a small stove. Some more points in regards to lime, which was used as a depilatory. It was used by the poor, while the rich would use fine flour, and the daughters of kings would use oil of myrrh, which is either perfumed oil or oil of olives which have grown less than a third. Also, it mentions that you should only spread lime on your body 1 limb at a time, because one guy did it to his daughter all at once, and she died as her body temperature raised too high. Also, this is only really required if you drink beer. It gives further definition as to the locations of the application of lime. It also mentions that this one sage tried to expound on the verse of the Maaseh Merkava, the esoteric passages from Ezekiel, so a hornet stung him on the forehead and he died, and they said it was his fault. Anyways, this is brought to teach us the word for forehead, which is used here. New Mishnah, some more minimums. Earth, Rabbi Akiva says the amount for the seal of cargo sacks. The rabbis say enough for the seal of letters. Fertilizer, or fine sand, Rabbi Akiva says it's enough to fertilize a single stalk of cabbage, but the sages say a leek. Coarse sand, enough to put on a full trowel of lime. A reed, enough to make a pen, but if it was thick or a cracked reed, the minimum is the amount to cook the most easily cooked eggs, which have already been beaten and placed in a pot. The Gemara explains in regards to mixing sand with lime. Some say this makes it better as it's stronger, some say it's better after the destruction of the temple as it looks worse. The reed, which is minimum pen size, is where it reaches to the joints of your fingers. We're not sure if this is the upper or lower joint. The egg that's easy to cook is either a dove egg, a hummingbird egg, or a hen egg, depending on which you hold is the easiest. Specifically, it's a dried fig's volume of this egg. New Mishnah, new list of minimums. A bone, large enough to make a spoon. Rabbi Yehuda says large enough to make a lock. Glass, large enough to scrape the head of a weaver's pick. A pebble or stone, large enough to throw at a bird. Others say an animal. The Gemara explains that the bone is being used for the teeth of a lock, which is smaller than the first opinion of a spoon. The others are also defined. The stone being thrown must be large enough that the animal could feel it, which is about 10 zuz. It also discusses the laws of a bunch of types of stones for different uses, particularly in regards to using them to clean yourself after using the restroom, which was something done back then. The principle in this regard and the discussions go on for a bit. It also explains some other of such things used for the restroom, like shards of pottery, which are problematic, mostly because it's dangerous, but also because it makes you susceptible to witchcraft. It mentions a story here where the sages were traveling on a boat, but they didn't take a noblewoman with them, so she said a spell that immobilized the boat, so they said a spell which released them. Anyway, she said she could do nothing to them, as they didn't do things that make them susceptible to sorcery, such as cleaning yourself with a shard of pottery, killing a louse while it's on your clothes, and they also don't pull vegetables out of tied bundles to eat. It also lists the proper healthy manner of using the restroom, and discusses some other materials like stone and grass. Last mission of the chapter, some more minimums. Earthenware, enough to place between 2 slats. Others say enough to pick up fire, like a coal. Others say enough to hold a revi'is of liquid. They try to bring proofs from a verse which says, "And there shall be found among its pieces a shard with which to pick up fire from the hearth, or to scoop water from a hole," implying like those last two. The Gemara argued about which of these were larger, and based on implication from the verse, it says that the fire opinion is a large fire. The argument is over the size of the shard in question, whether it's a significant piece, which is large enough to carry water, whether it is or isn't, and what the verse references, and that's the end of chapter 8.